Question 1. The review process indicates a former industrial site with documented soil contamination by chlorinated solvents and a significant groundwater plume of the same contaminants extending beyond the property boundary. Preliminary assessments suggest that excavation of the most heavily impacted soil areas is feasible, but the extent of groundwater contamination requires careful consideration. The auditor must recommend a primary remediation strategy. Which of the following approaches best aligns with comprehensive environmental remediation principles and regulatory expectations for such a scenario? Option A. Focus solely on excavation of all visibly impacted soil, assuming this will naturally mitigate the groundwater contamination over time. Option B. Prioritize the cheapest available remediation technology for the soil, such as in situ stabilization, without a detailed assessment of its effectiveness on the groundwater plume or long-term monitoring needs. Option C. Implement a phased approach beginning with excavation of the most contaminated soil zones, followed by in situ chemical oxidation (ISCO) for residual soil contamination and a pump-and-treat system for the groundwater plume, coupled with a robust long-term monitoring program. Option D. Install a soil vapor extraction (SV) system to address the volatile components of the chlorinated solvents in the soil and monitor the groundwater plume without active remediation. Correct answer is C. Implement a phased approach beginning with excavation of the most contaminated soil zones, followed by in situ chemical oxidation (ISCO) for residual soil contamination and a pump-and-treat system for the groundwater plume, coupled with a robust long-term monitoring program. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental auditing, selecting the most appropriate remediation technology for a contaminated site when multiple options exist, each with varying effectiveness, costs, and regulatory implications. The auditor must balance technical feasibility, regulatory compliance, cost-effectiveness, and long-term site stewardship. The presence of both soil and groundwater contamination, coupled with the need for long-term monitoring, adds complexity. The auditor's judgment is critical in ensuring the chosen technology aligns with the site's specific characteristics and regulatory objectives, preventing potential future liabilities and environmental harm. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive evaluation of all viable remediation technologies against the specific site conditions, contaminant types and concentrations, regulatory requirements, e.g., EPA's RCRA or CERCLA regulations in the U.S., depending on the site's history and classification, and cost-benefit analysis. This includes considering the effectiveness of each technology for both soil and groundwater, the potential for off-site impacts, the feasibility of implementation, and the long-term monitoring requirements. Selecting a technology that addresses both soil and groundwater contamination holistically, such as a combination of excavation for highly contaminated soil and in situ treatment, or pump and treat for groundwater, while also planning for robust long-term monitoring, represents best professional practice. This ensures regulatory compliance, minimizes future environmental risks, and optimizes resource allocation, aligning with the auditor's duty to protect human health and the environment. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that solely focuses on excavation for soil contamination without adequately addressing the commingled groundwater plume would be a regulatory failure. Excavation alone may not be sufficient to prevent the migration of contaminants into groundwater or to remediate existing groundwater contamination, potentially leading to non-compliance with groundwater protection standards. Ethically, it fails to provide a complete solution to the environmental problem. An approach that prioritizes a single, less invasive technology like soil vapor extraction, SV, for soil contamination, while neglecting the significant groundwater contamination, is also problematic. SVE is primarily effective for volatile organic compounds in unsaturated soil and would not address dissolved phase contaminants in groundwater, leading to incomplete remediation and potential long-term environmental liability. This represents a failure to meet regulatory cleanup goals for all affected media. An approach that selects the cheapest remediation option without a thorough technical and regulatory justification, even if it appears to address the immediate contamination, is an ethical and regulatory failure. Cost should be a factor in a cost-benefit analysis, but it should not override the requirement for effective and compliant remediation. Choosing an ineffective or insufficient technology based solely on cost can lead to ongoing environmental damage and future remediation expenses, violating the auditor's responsibility to ensure effective environmental protection. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a thorough site characterization and understanding of regulatory objectives. This involves 1. Identifying all applicable regulations and cleanup standards for both soil and groundwater. 2. Evaluating the nature and extent of contamination in each medium. 3. Researching and assessing the technical feasibility, effectiveness, and limitations of various remediation technologies for the specific contaminants and site conditions. 4. Conducting a cost-benefit analysis for promising technologies, considering capital costs, operation and maintenance costs, and long-term monitoring expenses. 5. Assessing the potential for off-site impacts and community concerns. 6. Selecting the technology or combination of technologies that best meets regulatory requirements, is technically sound, cost-effective over the long term, and minimizes environmental risk. 7. Developing a comprehensive remediation plan that includes clear performance metrics and a robust long-term monitoring strategy. Question 2. The analysis reveals that a manufacturing facility is proposing to introduce a new chemical process that promises significant cost reductions, but may also increase the potential for air emissions of volatile organic compounds, VOC. As the Certified Environmental, Health and Safety Auditor, you are tasked with evaluating this proposal. Which of the following represents the most appropriate decision-making framework to ensure compliance and responsible environmental management? Option A. Recommend approval of the new process based on the projected cost savings, assuming that existing emission control equipment will be sufficient. Option B. Advise against the new process due to the inherent risk of increased VOC emissions, without further investigation into specific control measures. Option C. Approve the new process, relying on general industry best practices for emission control rather than specific regulatory requirements for VOCs. Option D. Conduct a detailed environmental impact assessment, consulting relevant air quality regulations, and evaluating the effectiveness of proposed emission control technologies for the specific VOCs involved, before making a recommendation. The correct answer is A. Recommend approval of the new process based on the projected cost savings, assuming that existing emission control equipment will be sufficient. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for EHS auditors where a proposed operational change, while potentially offering economic benefits, carries significant environmental risks. The auditor must balance the company's business objectives with its legal and ethical obligations to protect the environment. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the potential environmental impacts, understanding the nuances of relevant regulations, and recommending a course of action that is both compliant and sustainable, without succumbing to pressure for expediency. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, risk-based assessment of the proposed changes' environmental implications. This aligns with the principles of responsible environmental management and the proactive stance required by EHS auditing. It necessitates consulting the specific environmental regulations applicable to the facility's operations and the proposed activity, identifying potential pollutants, and evaluating the effectiveness of proposed mitigation measures. This approach upholds the auditor's professional duty to ensure compliance and promote environmental stewardship, reflecting best practices in EHS auditing, which prioritize data-driven decision-making and regulatory adherence. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to approve the change based solely on the projected cost savings, without a comprehensive environmental impact assessment. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement to prevent or minimize pollution, and could lead to significant environmental damage and subsequent legal penalties. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty to protect public health and the environment. Another incorrect approach would be to reject the change outright due to a generalized fear of environmental impact, without a detailed analysis of the specific risks and potential mitigation strategies. While cautious, this approach may stifle innovation and operational improvements that could be implemented safely and compliantly. It lacks the balanced, evidence-based judgment expected of a professional auditor. A third incorrect approach would be to rely on outdated or irrelevant environmental guidelines. This would lead to a flawed assessment, potentially overlooking current regulatory requirements or emerging environmental concerns, thereby compromising the integrity of the audit and exposing the company to non-compliance risks. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with understanding the scope of the proposed change and its potential environmental touchpoints. This involves identifying all applicable environmental laws and regulations, conducting a detailed risk assessment of potential impacts, evaluating the adequacy of proposed control measures, and consulting with relevant technical experts if necessary. The decision should be based on objective evidence and a clear understanding of regulatory obligations, ensuring that any operational changes are both economically viable and environmentally sound. Question 3. Market research demonstrates that a rapidly expanding manufacturing company has recently acquired 3 new production facilities in different geographical regions. The company's existing environmental management system, EMS, certified to ISO 14001, has been effective at its original sites. However, the integration of these new facilities into the EMS is being handled by the operations team, with a focus on ensuring basic operational continuity and cost containment. The approach involves a general review of the company's existing environmental policies and procedures, with the expectation that these will largely apply to the new sites. The operations team is prioritizing the immediate resumption of production over a detailed, site-specific environmental assessment for each new acquisition. As a certified environmental, health and safety auditor, you are tasked with evaluating the company's compliance with its EMS and ISO 14001 requirements. Which of the following approaches to integrating the new facilities into the EMS represents the most professionally sound and compliant course of action? Option A. Defer the full integration of the new facilities into the EMS until operational issues or environmental incidents necessitate a review. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive environmental aspect and impact assessment for each new facility. Identify all site-specific legal and other requirements, and establish tailored environmental objectives and targets for fully integrating them into the EMS. Option C. Prioritize cost savings by performing only a superficial review of environmental aspects for the new facilities, focusing exclusively on the most obvious and high-impact environmental concerns. Option D. Assume that the environmental aspects and legal requirements identified for the original facilities are directly applicable to the new sites, requiring only minor adjustments to existing procedures. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive environmental aspect and impact assessment for each new facility, identify all site-specific legal and other requirements, and establish tailored environmental objectives and targets for fully integrating them into the EMS. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in implementing environmental management systems, EMS, within a growing organization. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for robust environmental performance with the practical constraints of resource allocation, and the potential for overlooking critical aspects during rapid expansion. The auditor must discern whether the company's approach to integrating new facilities into its existing EMS is systematic and compliant with ISO 14001 principles, or if it's a reactive, potentially non-compliant and inefficient process. The pressure to maintain operational continuity and cost-effectiveness can lead to shortcuts that undermine the integrity of the EMS. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a proactive and systematic integration of new facilities into the existing EMS, adhering to the principles of ISO 14001. This includes conducting a thorough environmental aspect and impact assessment for each new site, identifying all relevant legal and other requirements applicable to those specific locations, and then establishing appropriate environmental objectives and targets. This systematic process ensures that the EMS is comprehensive and addresses the unique environmental profile of each operational unit. It aligns with the ISO 14001 requirement for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving an EMS, particularly clauses related to planning 4.3, 1 environmental aspects 4.3, 2 legal and other requirements 4.3, 3 objectives, targets and programs and implementation and operation 4.4, 1 resources, roles, responsibility and authority. This approach demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to environmental responsibility. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves deferring the full integration of new facilities into the EMS until operational issues arise. This is a reactive strategy that violates the proactive nature of EMS planning. It fails to identify potential environmental risks and impacts before they manifest, leading to potential noncompliance with legal requirements and increased costs for remediation. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of commitment to environmental protection and a disregard for the principles of ISO 14001, which mandates systematic identification and management of environmental aspects. Another incorrect approach is to assume that the environmental aspects and legal requirements of existing facilities are directly transferable to new sites without specific assessment. This overlooks the unique geographical, operational, and regulatory context of each new location. It can lead to non-compliance with local environmental laws and regulations, and a failure to address site-specific significant environmental aspects. This approach is a failure in due diligence and a breach of the ISO 14001 requirement for identifying and evaluating environmental aspects and legal requirements for all operational activities. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize cost savings by only conducting a superficial review of environmental aspects for new facilities, focusing solely on obvious, high-impact issues. This neglects the potential for cumulative impacts or less obvious, but still significant environmental aspects. It undermines the principle of continual improvement and the thoroughness required by ISO 14001 to manage all significant environmental aspects effectively. This approach is ethically questionable as it prioritizes financial gain over comprehensive environmental stewardship. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach the integration of new facilities into an EMS by following a structured, risk-based methodology aligned with ISO 14001. This involves a phased approach. First, understanding the context of the new facility. Second, identifying and evaluating its environmental aspects and impacts. Third, determining applicable legal and other requirements. Fourth, setting appropriate objectives and targets. And finally, integrating these into the operational controls and monitoring mechanisms of the existing EMS. This systematic process ensures compliance, minimizes environmental risk, and supports the organization's commitment to continual improvement. When faced with resource constraints, professionals should advocate for adequate resource allocation for proper EMS integration, rather than compromising on essential environmental management processes. Question 4. System analysis indicates that a manufacturing facility is undergoing a routine environmental audit. The facility operates under multiple environmental permits, including air emissions, wastewater discharge, and hazardous waste management. The auditor needs to assess the facility's overall environmental compliance and identify potential areas for improvement. Which of the following audit approaches would best ensure a comprehensive and effective assessment of the facility's environmental performance and regulatory adherence? Option A. Concentrate solely on the facility's compliance with the Clean Water Act, assuming that strong performance in this area implies adequate compliance across all other environmental domains. Option B. Conduct a detailed review of all current environmental permits and associated monitoring reports, followed by on-site inspections to verify operational controls against applicable standards, e.g., NESHAP, NSPS, NPDES, and assess the facility's emergency response plans and reporting procedures, e.g., EPCRA, SBCC. Option C. Perform a cursory review of the facility's environmental policy and a limited number of operational logs, prioritizing speed over depth of investigation. Option D. Focus exclusively on identifying any historical violations or fines issued by regulatory agencies in the past 5 years, without delving into the facility's current operational practices or management systems. Correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed review of all current environmental permits and associated monitoring reports, followed by on-site inspections to verify operational controls against applicable standards, e.g., NESHAP, NSPS, NPDES, and assess the facility's emergency response plans and reporting procedures, e.g., EPCRA, SBCC. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for EHS auditors, assessing the effectiveness of a facility's environmental management system in the face of evolving regulatory requirements and potential noncompliance. The auditor must not only identify existing issues, but also anticipate future risks and ensure the system is robust enough to adapt. The complexity arises from the interconnectedness of various environmental regulations, CWA, ARCRA, EPCRA, and the need to integrate compliance across different operational areas. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates a proactive and comprehensive audit strategy. It prioritizes a thorough review of existing permits and monitoring data to establish a baseline, followed by an assessment of operational controls against relevant standards, NESHAP, NSPS, NPDES. Crucially, it includes an evaluation of the facility's emergency preparedness and reporting mechanisms, EPCRA, SBCC, which are vital for mitigating immediate environmental harm and ensuring community safety. This approach aligns with best professional practice by focusing on risk identification, compliance verification, and the overall effectiveness of the EHS management system, reflecting the principles of due diligence and responsible environmental stewardship expected of a certified EHS auditor. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on identifying past violations without assessing the underlying systemic causes or future compliance risks. This reactive stance fails to address the root causes of non-compliance and leaves the facility vulnerable to future issues, violating the auditor's responsibility to promote continuous improvement. Another incorrect approach prioritizes a superficial review of documentation without verifying its accuracy through on-site inspections and operational assessments. This overlooks potential discrepancies between written procedures and actual practices, leading to a false sense of compliance and failing to meet the auditor's duty to provide an objective and thorough evaluation. A third incorrect approach concentrates only on one specific environmental regulation, such as the Clean Air Act, while neglecting other critical areas like hazardous waste management (ARCRA) or water pollution control (CWA). This fragmented approach creates blind spots, potentially allowing significant noncompliance in other regulated areas to go undetected, thereby failing to provide a holistic assessment of the facility's EHS performance. Professional reasoning. Certified EHS auditors must adopt a systematic and risk-based approach. This involves understanding the facility's operations, identifying applicable regulations, evaluating the effectiveness of existing controls, and verifying compliance through a combination of document review, interviews, and on-site observations. The auditor's judgment should be guided by the principles of integrity, objectivity, and due professional care, ensuring that the audit provides valuable insights for improving environmental performance and mitigating risks. Question 5. During the evaluation of a manufacturing facility's compliance with hazardous waste management regulations, an auditor is reviewing the facility's waste accumulation areas. The auditor observes several drums that appear to be leaking. Which of the following actions best demonstrates adherence to environmental auditing principles and practices for regulatory compliance? Option A. Making a general note in the audit report that the waste accumulation areas may have minor containment issues without further specific investigation or documentation. Option B. Interviewing the facility's environmental manager to ask if they are aware of any leaks and noting their verbal assurance that the situation is under control. Option C. Focusing primarily on the facility's waste minimization efforts, assuming that good waste minimization practices would inherently prevent significant leaks. Option D. Documenting the observed leaks with photographs and detailed notes, cross-referencing the types of waste in the drums with the facility's hazardous waste manifests and permits, and noting any discrepancies or potential violations of containment requirements. Correct answer is B. Interviewing the facility's environmental manager to ask if they are aware of any leaks and noting their verbal assurance that the situation is under control. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental auditing, balancing the need for comprehensive evidence gathering with the practical constraints of time and resources, while adhering to regulatory compliance requirements. The auditor must demonstrate due diligence in their investigation without overstepping the defined audit scope or compromising the integrity of the audit process. The professional challenge lies in identifying and documenting nonconformances effectively, ensuring that the findings are supported by sufficient, credible evidence, and that recommendations are actionable and aligned with the audit objectives and the applicable regulatory framework. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the systematic collection of objective evidence directly related to the audit objectives and scope. This aligns with the principles of regulatory compliance auditing, which mandates verification against specific legal and regulatory requirements. By focusing on documented procedures, records, and direct observation of activities, the auditor ensures that findings are grounded in factual data, thereby supporting the credibility and defensibility of the audit report. This methodical approach also facilitates the identification of root causes for nonconformances, which is crucial for effective corrective action planning and preventing recurrence, a key expectation under most environmental regulatory frameworks. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal information or hearsay fails to meet the standard of objective evidence required for a compliance audit. This can lead to unsubstantiated findings, which are professionally indefensible and can undermine the auditor's credibility and the audit's value. Such an approach risks misinterpreting situations or making accusations without factual basis, potentially leading to incorrect conclusions and recommendations. Ethically, it violates the principle of integrity and objectivity. Another incorrect approach that focuses on broad generalizations without specific evidence is also professionally unacceptable. Compliance audits require precise identification of deviations from established standards or regulations. Generalizations do not provide the specificity needed for corrective actions or for demonstrating compliance status. This approach can lead to a superficial audit that misses critical issues or overstates minor ones, failing to provide meaningful insights for improvement or regulatory assurance. It neglects the fundamental requirement of audit protocols to gather specific, verifiable data. A further incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness by skipping critical verification steps like document review or site inspections is professionally unsound. This compromises the audit's effectiveness and its ability to identify actual risks or nonconformances. It suggests a lack of commitment to the audit's purpose and can result in a report that is incomplete or inaccurate, potentially leaving the organization vulnerable to regulatory penalties or environmental incidents. This approach demonstrates a failure in professional diligence and adherence to audit best practices. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a clear understanding of the audit objectives and scope, a thorough review of the relevant regulatory framework, and the systematic application of evidence-gathering techniques. Auditors must continuously assess the sufficiency and appropriateness of the evidence collected, ensuring it directly supports any findings or conclusions. When faced with time constraints, auditors should prioritize the most critical areas for investigation and communicate any limitations to the auditee and the audit program manager. Ethical considerations, such as objectivity and due professional care, must guide every step of the audit process. Question 6. The efficiency study reveals that two distinct air sampling techniques were employed to assess particulate matter levels at a facility, one utilizing a high-volume air sampler with gravimetric analysis, and the other employing a portable direct treating instrument that provides real-time PM2.5 concentrations. Both techniques were used concurrently over a 24-hour period. Which approach, when considering regulatory defensibility and comprehensive data for compliance reporting, represents the most robust and professionally sound methodology for auditing purposes? Option A. A combined approach where the direct treating instrument's data is used for initial screening, and the high-volume sampler is deployed only when the direct treating instrument indicates potential exceedances to confirm the findings. Option B. Relying on the direct treating instrument's data and supplementing it with historical data from previous audits conducted using similar instruments to establish a trend. Option C. The high-volume air sampler with gravimetric analysis, as it is a recognized EPA-approved method for determining total suspended particulates and can be used to calculate PM2.5 concentrations with appropriate methodology, providing a definitive mass measurement for regulatory compliance. Option D. The portable direct treating instrument, due to its ability to provide immediate feedback on PM2.5 levels, allowing for rapid identification of potential exceedances and immediate corrective actions. The correct answer is C. The high-volume air sampler with gravimetric analysis, as it is a recognized EPA-approved method for determining total suspended particulates and can be used to calculate PM2.5 concentrations with appropriate methodology, providing a definitive mass measurement for regulatory compliance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for EHS auditors, reconciling potentially conflicting data from different sampling methodologies and analytical techniques. The auditor must exercise critical judgment to determine the most reliable and defensible approach, considering regulatory compliance, data integrity, and the intended purpose of the sampling program. The challenge lies in understanding the inherent limitations and strengths of each method, and ensuring that the chosen approach meets the stringent requirements of EPA-approved methods and robust QA/QC protocols. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes the use of EPA-approved methods for both sampling and analysis, coupled with rigorous QA/QC procedures. This aligns directly with regulatory expectations for environmental data used in compliance and decision-making. EPA-approved methods provide standardized, validated protocols that ensure comparability and defensibility of results. Robust QA/QC, including proper chain of custody, sample preservation, and the use of blanks and duplicates, is essential for demonstrating data integrity and identifying potential sources of error or contamination. This approach ensures that the data collected is scientifically sound, legally defensible, and suitable for its intended purpose, such as demonstrating compliance with air quality standards or assessing the extent of soil contamination. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that relies solely on field measurements without laboratory confirmation for critical analytes would be professionally unacceptable. While field measurements like pH and conductivity are valuable for initial assessments and identifying trends, they often lack the specificity and accuracy required for regulatory compliance or definitive risk assessment. Many regulated contaminants require laboratory analysis using sophisticated instrumentation like GC/MS or ICP-MS to achieve the necessary detection limits and identification. This approach risks generating inaccurate or incomplete data, leading to misinformed decisions and potential noncompliance. An approach that prioritizes speed and cost-effectiveness over adherence to EPA-approved methods and proper QA/QC would also be a significant failure. Using non-validated sampling techniques or analytical methods, or neglecting essential QA/QC steps like maintaining the chain of custody or proper sample preservation, compromises data integrity. This can lead to the generation of unreliable data that is not legally defensible. Ethically, auditors have a responsibility to ensure the accuracy and reliability of the data they generate or review. And cutting corners on established protocols violates this principle. An approach that uses analytical instrumentation without understanding its limitations or ensuring proper calibration and maintenance is also flawed. While advanced instruments like ICP-MS are powerful tools, their effectiveness depends on correct operation, calibration, and understanding of potential interferences. Without these safeguards, the analytical results can be inaccurate, leading to incorrect conclusions about environmental conditions. This demonstrates a lack of technical competence and a failure to uphold professional standards. Professional reasoning. When faced with such a scenario, an EHS auditor should follow a systematic decision-making process. First, clearly define the objectives of the sampling program and the regulatory requirements applicable to the site and contaminants of concern. Second, evaluate the available sampling and analytical methodologies against these objectives and requirements, prioritizing EPA-approved methods where applicable. Third, meticulously plan and implement QA/QC procedures to ensure data quality and defensibility. Fourth, critically assess the collected data, considering potential sources of error and variability, and interpret it in the context of regulatory standards and site-specific conditions. Finally, document all steps taken, including rationale for method selection and any deviations from standard procedures, to ensure transparency and accountability. Question 7. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a recent spill of a chemical solvent has occurred near a designated wetland habitat for a protected amphibian species. Given the limited data on the specific toxicity of this solvent to amphibians and the potential for chronic effects, which of the following approaches would be the most professionally sound and regulatory compliant for the initial assessment of potential ecological impact? Option A. Conduct a qualitative ecological risk assessment focusing on hazard identification and exposure pathways relevant to the protected amphibian species, acknowledging data gaps and informing immediate containment and monitoring efforts. Option B. Prioritize a quantitative human health risk assessment for nearby residential areas, as this is typically a higher regulatory priority than ecological impacts. Option C. Immediately implement broad-spectrum remediation strategies for the entire wetland area, assuming the worst-case scenario without a detailed assessment of specific risks to the amphibian species. Option D. Defer any detailed ecological risk assessment until comprehensive, long-term ecotoxicity studies for the specific solvent and amphibian species are completed, as a preliminary assessment would be too uncertain. The correct answer is A. Conduct a qualitative ecological risk assessment focusing on hazard identification and exposure pathways relevant to the protected amphibian species, acknowledging data gaps and informing immediate containment and monitoring efforts. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental auditing, determining the most appropriate method for characterizing the potential impact of a known contaminant release on a sensitive ecological receptor. The auditor must balance the need for a scientifically sound assessment with practical constraints, such as available data and the urgency of the situation. The presence of a protected species adds a layer of regulatory and ethical complexity, requiring a robust approach that can withstand scrutiny and ensure adequate protection. The challenge lies in selecting an assessment methodology that is both technically defensible and aligns with the principles of risk management and regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, focusing on a qualitative ecological risk assessment that prioritizes hazard identification and exposure assessment for the specific protected species, represents best professional practice. This aligns with the precautionary principle often embedded in environmental regulations, which mandates protective action in the face of scientific uncertainty. By identifying the specific hazards posed by the contaminant and assessing the likelihood and magnitude of exposure to the protected species, this method provides a clear, albeit less precise, understanding of the potential risk. This qualitative approach is often the most practical and ethically sound starting point when detailed quantitative data is scarce or prohibitively expensive to obtain, especially when dealing with sensitive ecosystems and protected species where the consequence of underestimation is high. It allows for informed decision-making regarding immediate management actions and can guide the need for more detailed quantitative assessments if initial findings warrant it. This approach is consistent with the spirit of regulations aimed at protecting biodiversity and preventing irreversible environmental damage. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that solely relies on quantitative human health risk assessment methodologies, ignoring the specific ecological receptors, is professionally unacceptable. This represents a significant regulatory failure because it disregards the explicit mandate to protect ecological systems, particularly protected species, which are often subject to specific environmental protection laws. Ethically, it prioritizes human concerns over the intrinsic value and legal protection afforded to wildlife, an approach that focuses exclusively on risk management strategies without a preceding hazard identification and exposure assessment is also professionally flawed. This bypasses the fundamental steps of risk assessment, leading to potentially misdirected or ineffective management actions. It is a regulatory failure because it does not demonstrate due diligence in understanding the nature and extent of the risk before implementing controls. Ethically, it risks expending resources on ineffective measures or failing to address the most critical risks, an approach that dismisses the need for any risk assessment due to the perceived low volume of the release is professionally negligent. This is a critical regulatory and ethical failure. Environmental regulations typically do not exempt releases based solely on volume, without considering the inherent toxicity of the substance, the sensitivity of the receiving environment, and the potential for bioaccumulation or chronic effects. This approach fails to uphold the auditor's responsibility to identify and evaluate all potential environmental hazards. Professional reasoning. When faced with a potential environmental impact, a certified environmental, health and safety auditor must adopt a systematic and defensible approach. The decision-making process should begin with a thorough understanding of the regulatory framework applicable to the specific jurisdiction and the nature of the potential impact. This involves prioritizing the protection of human health and the environment, with particular attention to legally protected resources like endangered species. The auditor should first identify potential hazards associated with the release. Subsequently, they must assess the likelihood and magnitude of exposure to relevant receptors, which in this case includes the protected species. Based on this assessment, the risk is characterized. If the risk is deemed significant, appropriate risk management strategies are developed and implemented. Throughout this process, Any uncertainties must be acknowledged and analyzed. When data is limited, a qualitative approach that errs on the side of caution is often the most prudent and ethically sound choice, guiding further investigation or immediate protective measures. Question 8. Regulatory review indicates a manufacturing facility proposes to consolidate various waste streams, including spent solvents, contaminated rags, and off-spec chemical products, into a single bulk container for off-site disposal, citing cost-saving benefits. As a certified environmental, health and safety auditor, what is the most appropriate approach to address this proposal, considering the U.S. EPA's Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) regulations? Option A. Inform the facility that consolidating diverse waste streams without rigorous, stream-by-stream identification and classification according to RCRA criteria is a violation, and each waste must be managed independently based on its specific hazardous characteristics. Option B. Recommend that the facility proceed with consolidation, assuming that the majority of the waste is non-hazardous and the minor hazardous components will be diluted to acceptable levels for disposal. Option C. Suggests that the facility obtain a general permit for mixed waste consolidation from the EPA, as this is a common practice for streamlining waste management. Option D. Advise the facility that consolidating waste streams is permissible as long as the final mixture is characterized and managed as hazardous waste, provided it does not create a more hazardous material or impede proper disposal. The correct answer is D. Advise the facility that consolidating waste streams is permissible as long as the final mixture is characterized and managed as hazardous waste, provided it does not create a more hazardous material or impede proper disposal. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the auditor to balance the operational needs of a manufacturing facility with stringent regulatory requirements for hazardous waste management. The facility's desire to streamline processes and reduce costs by consolidating waste streams must be critically evaluated against the legal obligations to accurately identify, classify, and manage hazardous waste. Failure to do so can result in significant fines, environmental damage, and reputational harm. The auditor must possess a deep understanding of the applicable regulations, particularly concerning waste characterization, and the specific prohibitions against mixing hazardous and non-hazardous wastes. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes regulatory compliance and environmental protection, accurately identifying and classifying each waste stream according to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) regulations is the foundational step in hazardous waste management. The prohibition against mixing hazardous waste with non-hazardous waste or other hazardous wastes in a way that would render it more difficult to manage or increase its hazard is a core tenet of RCRA. This approach ensures that each waste stream is managed according to its specific hazard characteristics and regulatory requirements, preventing improper disposal, environmental contamination, and potential liability. It aligns with the auditor's ethical duty to uphold environmental laws and protect public health. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that assumes consolidation of waste streams is permissible without rigorous characterization and regulatory review is a significant regulatory failure. This overlooks the fundamental RCRA principle that hazardous waste must be managed as hazardous from cradle to grave. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for environmental stewardship. An approach that relies solely on the generator's subjective assessment of waste hazard without independent verification or adherence to specific RCRA identification and classification procedures is also a failure. This bypasses established regulatory protocols and can lead to misclassification, improper management, and potential environmental harm. It represents an ethical lapse by not ensuring due diligence. An approach that prioritizes cost savings and operational efficiency over accurate waste classification and management, even if it means overlooking potential regulatory noncompliance, is a critical ethical and regulatory failure. This demonstrates a prioritization of business interests above legal obligations and environmental responsibility, which is unacceptable for a certified auditor. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first thoroughly understanding the applicable regulatory framework, in this case, U.S. EPA RCRA regulations. This involves reviewing the facility's waste generation processes, conducting on-site inspection, and reviewing all available waste characterization data. The auditor must then apply the specific criteria for hazardous waste identification and classification. If there is any doubt or ambiguity, the auditor should err on the side of caution and assume the waste is hazardous until proven otherwise through appropriate testing and analysis. The auditor must then evaluate the proposed waste consolidation against specific RCRA prohibitions and management standards. Communication with facility management regarding regulatory requirements and potential risks is crucial throughout the process. Question 9. Governance review demonstrates that a manufacturing company operating under stringent air quality regulations is proposing to implement an emissions trading scheme for its primary pollutant to achieve compliance. The company argues this will be more economically efficient than investing in end-of-pipe control technologies mandated by current regulations. As a certified environmental, health and safety auditor, what is the most appropriate approach to evaluating this proposal? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis of the proposed emissions trading scheme, assessing its environmental effectiveness, economic efficiency, and potential for innovation, while ensuring it meets or exceeds the environmental protection standards set by the relevant regulations. Option B. Reject the emissions trading scheme outright and insist on the company installing the mandated end-of-pipe control technologies, as this represents the established and proven regulatory compliance method. Option C. Focus solely on the company's projected cost savings from the trading scheme, as the primary auditor responsibility is to identify opportunities for operational cost reduction for the client. Option D. Recommend immediate adoption of the emissions trading scheme based on the company's assertion of economic efficiency, as regulatory compliance is primarily an economic consideration. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis of the proposed emissions trading scheme, assessing its environmental effectiveness, economic efficiency, and potential for innovation, while ensuring it meets or exceeds the environmental protection standards set by the relevant regulations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for EHS auditors, where a company is seeking to comply with environmental regulations while minimizing economic burden. The auditor must navigate the complexities of environmental economics and policy, specifically understanding how different policy instruments can achieve environmental objectives and their associated economic impacts. The challenge lies in evaluating the effectiveness and appropriateness of a proposed market-based instrument against traditional command and control approaches, considering both environmental outcomes and economic efficiency, all within the specified regulatory framework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough cost-benefit analysis that considers the full spectrum of environmental and economic impacts of the proposed emissions trading scheme. This includes quantifying the benefits of reduced pollution, e.g., improved public health, ecosystem services, and the costs of implementation and compliance for the regulated entities. It also requires an assessment of the scheme's potential to achieve the desired environmental outcome, e.g., emission reduction targets, in an economically efficient manner, fostering innovation and flexibility. This aligns with the principles of sound environmental policy design, which often favors market-based instruments when they can achieve environmental goals at a lower overall cost to society compared to prescriptive regulations. The auditor's role is to verify that the company's proposal is robust, scientifically sound, and demonstrably capable of meeting regulatory requirements while considering economic realities. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the immediate cost savings for the company without adequately assessing the environmental effectiveness and potential for unintended consequences of the emissions trading scheme. This fails to uphold the primary objective of environmental regulations, which is to protect the environment. Ethically, it prioritizes short-term economic gain over long-term environmental sustainability and public well-being. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss market-based instruments entirely in favor of traditional command and control regulations, without a proper evaluation of their comparative effectiveness and efficiency. This ignores the potential for market-based approaches to achieve environmental goals more cost-effectively, and could lead to suboptimal environmental outcomes or unnecessary economic burdens. It represents a failure to engage with modern environmental policy tools and a lack of critical analysis. A third incorrect approach would be to propose a scheme that is overly complex or difficult to monitor and enforce, leading to potential loopholes or noncompliance. This undermines the integrity of the regulatory framework and could result in a failure to achieve the intended environmental improvements. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of practical implementation challenges and the importance of robust oversight. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific environmental objectives mandated by the relevant regulations. They should then critically evaluate the proposed policy instrument, in this case, an emissions trading scheme, against these objectives, considering its potential economic impacts, environmental effectiveness, and administrative feasibility. A comprehensive cost-benefit analysis, incorporating both direct and indirect costs and benefits, is crucial. The decision-making process should involve comparing the proposed market-based approach with alternative regulatory instruments to determine the most efficient and effective means of achieving compliance and environmental protection. Transparency, scientific rigor, and adherence to ethical principles of environmental stewardship are paramount. Question 10. System analysis indicates that a prospective property buyer is considering acquiring a parcel of land with a documented history of light industrial manufacturing. The buyer's primary concern is to understand and mitigate potential environmental liabilities associated with the property before closing the transaction. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of environmental due diligence and regulatory compliance for this scenario? Option A. Focus solely on reviewing publicly available environmental regulatory databases for any past violations or enforcement actions associated with the property's address. Option B. Prioritize the identification and review of any recorded environmental liens or encumbrances against the property title, as these directly signal existing environmental liabilities. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive Phase I environmental site assessment, ESSA, following ASTM E1527-13 standards, including a thorough records review, site reconnaissance, and interviews. If recognized environmental conditions (REC) are identified, proceed to a Phase II ESA for soil and groundwater sampling. Option D. Immediately initiate extensive soil and groundwater sampling across the entire property to identify any existing contamination, as this is the most direct way to uncover potential issues. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive Phase I environmental site assessment, ESSA, following ASTM E1527-13 standards, including a thorough records review, site reconnaissance, and interviews. If recognized environmental conditions (REC) are identified, proceed to a Phase II ESA for soil and groundwater sampling. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental consulting, where a client, seeking to acquire a property with a history of industrial use, needs to understand potential environmental liabilities. The challenge lies in balancing the need for thorough due diligence, as mandated by regulatory frameworks and industry standards like ASTM, with the client's desire for a cost-effective and timely assessment. The auditor must navigate the complexities of historical data, potential contamination, and the evolving regulatory landscape to provide a clear picture of environmental risks without over or understating them. Inherent uncertainty in historical records and the potential for unknown contamination require a systematic and defensible approach. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased assessment that begins with a comprehensive Phase I environmental site assessment, ESSA, in accordance with ASTM E1527-13, or the most current applicable ASTM standard for ESAs in the specified jurisdiction, assuming U.S. EPA all appropriate inquiries rule compliance. This includes a thorough records review, historical aerial photographs, building permits, fire insurance maps, etc. A site reconnaissance to identify current and past uses and recognized environmental conditions, (REC), and interviews with current and past owners/occupants. If RECs are identified, the process logically progresses to a Phase II ESA, which may involve soil and groundwater sampling, to confirm or deny the presence of hazardous substances. This systematic, risk-based approach aligns with the principles of due diligence, aiming to identify potential liabilities before property acquisition. It directly addresses the all appropriate inquiries requirement, which is crucial for establishing landowner liability protection under CERCLA. This method ensures that the assessment is comprehensive, scientifically sound, and meets regulatory expectations for environmental risk assessment. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on a cursory review of readily available online regulatory database searches, without conducting a site reconnaissance or historical records review beyond the databases. This fails to meet the comprehensive requirements of ASTM standards and the All Appropriate Inquiries rule, as it overlooks crucial historical land use information and visual evidence of potential contamination that might not be reflected in databases. It also neglects the importance of interviews. Ethically, this approach is deficient as it does not provide the client with a sufficiently informed basis for their acquisition decision, potentially exposing them to unforeseen environmental liabilities. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately recommend extensive soil and groundwater sampling, phase Roman II ESA, without first conducting a phase IESA. This is inefficient and costly. A sampling should only be initiated when a phase IESA identifies RECs that warrant further investigation. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the tiered approach to ESAs and the principle of prudent resource allocation. This approach also fails to establish the necessary baseline of historical and current site conditions that a phase IESA provides, making the subsequent phase Roman II data less meaningful in the context of due diligence. A third incorrect approach would be to focus exclusively on identifying environmental liens and encumbrances without a thorough assessment of potential contamination. While environmental liens are important to identify, they are a consequence of contamination or regulatory action, not a primary indicator of the presence of contamination itself. This approach would miss the fundamental goal of an ESA, which is to identify and assess potential environmental liabilities arising from the presence or threatened release of hazardous substances or petroleum products. It would fail to provide the client with a comprehensive understanding of the environmental condition of the property. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, phased approach to ESAs, guided by established standards like ASTM E1527-13 and regulatory requirements such as the EPA's All Appropriate Inquiries rule. The decision-making process should prioritize a thorough phase IESA as the foundational step. If RECs are identified, the next logical step is a phase Roman II ESA, tailored to the specific RECs. This tiered approach ensures that investigations are proportionate to the identified risks and that resources are used effectively. Professionals must maintain objectivity, adhere to ethical standards, and communicate findings clearly and comprehensively to the client, enabling informed decision-making regarding property transactions and potential environmental liabilities. Question 11. Implementation of a comprehensive pollution prevention plan for a manufacturing facility is being audited. The plan details significant investments in advanced wastewater treatment technologies and state-of-the-art air pollution control equipment, alongside a robust recycling program for specific waste streams. However, there is limited documentation or evidence of initiatives focused on source reduction or material substitution to prevent waste generation at its origin. How should the auditor assess the effectiveness and compliance of this pollution prevention plan? Option A. Accept the plan as compliant due to the substantial investment in recycling and advanced treatment technologies, assuming these effectively mitigate the environmental impact of the facility's operations. Option B. Focus primarily on the operational efficiency and regulatory compliance of the advanced wastewater treatment and air pollution control technologies, as these represent significant investments and address immediate environmental discharges. Option C. Assess the plan by reviewing the cost-effectiveness of the recycling program and the disposal costs associated with the treated wastewater and air emissions, as economic viability is a key indicator of sustainable practice. Option D. Evaluate the plan based on its adherence to the waste management hierarchy, prioritizing source reduction and reuse, and critically examine the evidence supporting the claimed benefits of the recycling program, while also assessing the operational efficiency and environmental performance of the wastewater and air pollution control technologies. The correct answer is D. Evaluate the plan based on its adherence to the waste management hierarchy, prioritizing source reduction and reuse, and critically examine the evidence supporting the claimed benefits of the recycling program, while also assessing the operational efficiency and environmental performance of the wastewater and air pollution control technologies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental auditing, balancing regulatory compliance with the practical and economic realities of implementing pollution prevention strategies. The auditor must assess not just whether a plan exists, but whether its implementation is effective, sustainable, and truly minimizes environmental impact, rather than merely shifting it. The challenge lies in discerning genuine source reduction from superficial changes, and in evaluating the long-term viability of chosen waste management techniques against evolving regulatory expectations and technological advancements. Professional judgment is required to differentiate between a technically compliant but environmentally suboptimal approach and one that demonstrates a commitment to continuous improvement and best available techniques. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach focuses on a holistic assessment of the waste management hierarchy, prioritizing source reduction and reuse as the most effective pollution prevention strategies. This aligns with the fundamental principles of waste management regulations, which universally advocate for minimizing waste generation at its origin. By evaluating the effectiveness of source reduction initiatives through measurable data and considering the feasibility of reuse programs, the auditor is demonstrating best professional practice. This approach is ethically sound as it prioritizes environmental protection and resource conservation. It is also regulatorily robust, as it addresses the spirit and intent of pollution prevention plans, which aim to reduce the overall environmental burden, not just manage waste after it is created. Life cycle assessment, LCA principles, even if not explicitly mandated for this specific plan, inform this best practice by considering the broader environmental impacts of material choices and processes. Incorrect approaches analysis, an approach that solely focuses on the efficiency of waste treatment technologies, such as incineration or landfilling, without a thorough evaluation of source reduction and reuse, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This is because it neglects the primary objective of pollution prevention plans, which is to minimize waste generation. Relying on end-of-pipe solutions, while sometimes necessary, is a less sustainable and often more environmentally damaging approach than preventing waste in the first place. Ethically, it suggests a lack of commitment to proactive environmental stewardship. Regulatorily, it may fall short of demonstrating due diligence in implementing a comprehensive pollution prevention strategy. Another incorrect approach would be to accept a pollution prevention plan that relies heavily on recycling without verifying the actual market demand and environmental benefit of the recycled materials. While recycling is a valuable component of waste management, if the recycled materials are not effectively processed or if there is no viable market for them, the environmental benefit is diminished, and the waste may ultimately end up in landfill. This approach fails to demonstrate a deep understanding of the waste management hierarchy and the practical challenges of recycling programs, potentially leading to a false sense of environmental compliance. Finally, an approach that prioritizes cost-effectiveness of waste disposal over the environmental impact of the chosen methods is professionally unacceptable. While economic considerations are important, they should not supersede the fundamental environmental protection goals of pollution prevention. Choosing a cheaper but more polluting disposal method, such as inadequate wastewater treatment or poorly managed landfilling, would be a clear ethical and regulatory failure, as it directly contravenes the principles of environmental stewardship and may violate specific discharge or disposal limits. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such audits by first understanding the specific regulatory requirements for pollution prevention plans in the relevant jurisdiction. This involves identifying the mandated elements, reporting requirements, and performance metrics. The auditor should then systematically evaluate the organization's plan against these requirements, paying close attention to the waste management hierarchy. This means scrutinizing source reduction efforts, assessing the feasibility and effectiveness of reuse programs, and then evaluating recycling and treatment technologies. Data collection and verification are crucial. Claims of waste reduction or successful reuse must be supported by evidence. When assessing treatment technologies, the auditor should consider their efficiency, environmental impact, and compliance with relevant permits and standards. The decision-making process should involve a risk-based approach, prioritizing areas with the greatest potential for environmental harm or regulatory noncompliance. ethical consideration, such as transparency and a commitment to genuine environmental improvement, should guide the auditor's judgment throughout the process. Question 12. Strategic planning requires an EHS auditor to assess a manufacturing facility's energy consumption and identify opportunities for improvement. The company is interested in reducing its environmental impact and operational costs. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the certified environmental, health and safety auditor's responsibilities in this context, considering regulatory compliance, energy audits, GHG emission, and sustainable development principles? Option A. Conduct a detailed energy audit to identify energy efficiency measures and renewable energy integration opportunities, quantify potential GHG emission reductions, and align recommendations with sustainable development principles and relevant U.S. EPA guidelines for environmental performance. Option B. Advise the company to adopt a broad corporate social responsibility (CSR) initiative focused on public perception of environmental friendliness, without specific technical recommendations or quantifiable EPI targets. Option C. Focus solely on implementing the cheapest energy-saving measures identified through a quick walkthrough, prioritizing short-term cost reductions over comprehensive environmental impact assessment. Option D. Recommend the immediate installation of solar panels on all available roof space, as this is a widely recognized renewable energy source, without a detailed site assessment or energy consumption analysis. Correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed energy audit to identify energy efficiency measures and renewable energy integration opportunities, quantify potential GHG emission reductions, and align recommendations with sustainable development principles and relevant U.S. EPA guidelines for environmental performance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for EHS auditors, balancing regulatory compliance with strategic business objectives in the context of energy management and sustainability. The company is seeking to improve its environmental performance and potentially reduce operational costs through energy efficiency and renewable energy adoption. However, the auditor must navigate the complexities of identifying the most impactful and compliant strategies within the specific regulatory framework of the Certified Environmental, Health and Safety Auditor exam jurisdiction, assumed to be U.S. EPA regulations for this example, as no specific jurisdiction was provided, but the principles apply broadly. The challenge lies in moving beyond mere compliance to proactive, value-adding recommendations that align with both environmental stewardship and business viability, while ensuring all proposed actions are legally sound and technically feasible. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive energy audit that not only identifies opportunities for energy efficiency and renewable energy integration, but also quantifies their potential GHG emission reductions and aligns them with established sustainability principles and relevant U.S. EPA guidelines. This approach is best professional practice because it directly addresses the core mandate of an EHS auditor, ensuring compliance and promoting best practices. By focusing on data-driven recommendations that consider GHG inventory, carbon footprint, and potential for climate change mitigation, the auditor provides actionable insights that can lead to tangible environmental benefits and cost savings. Furthermore, integrating principles of sustainable development and considering frameworks like LEED for green building design demonstrates a forward-thinking and holistic approach to environmental management, which is increasingly expected of EHS professionals. This approach ensures that recommendations are not only environmentally sound, but also economically justifiable and strategically aligned with the company's long-term goals. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on implementing the cheapest energy-saving measures without a thorough analysis of their GHG reduction potential or long-term sustainability impact. This fails to meet the auditor's responsibility to promote comprehensive environmental performance and could lead to missed opportunities for significant emission reductions or investments in less impactful technologies. It also neglects the broader context of climate change mitigation and sustainable development principles. Another incorrect approach would be to recommend the adoption of specific renewable energy technologies without first conducting a detailed feasibility study or considering the company's specific energy needs and site conditions. This could result in an inefficient or non-viable investment, leading to wasted resources and potentially failing to achieve the desired environmental or economic outcomes. It also bypasses the crucial step of understanding the existing energy consumption patterns and identifying the most appropriate solutions. A third incorrect approach would be to prioritize recommendations based on popular trends in corporate social responsibility, CSR, without a clear link to measurable environmental performance indicators, EPI, or regulatory requirements. While CSR is important, an EHS auditor's primary role is to ensure verifiable environmental improvements and compliance. Recommendations must be grounded in data and demonstrable impact, not just perceived good practice. This approach risks superficial engagement with sustainability rather than substantive environmental improvement. Professional reasoning. When faced with such a scenario, an EHS auditor should employ a systematic, data-driven decision-making process. This begins with a thorough understanding of the client's operations, energy consumption patterns, and existing environmental performance. The auditor must then identify relevant regulatory requirements and industry best practices, such as those outlined by the U.S. EPA for GHG reporting and energy management. The next step involves conducting a comprehensive energy audit to pinpoint specific areas for improvement, evaluating the technical feasibility and economic viability of various energy efficiency and renewable energy options. Crucially, the auditor must quantify the potential GHG emission reductions and carbon footprint improvements associated with each recommendation, aligning these with the principles of sustainable development and climate change mitigation. Finally, recommendations should be presented in a clear, actionable format, prioritizing those that offer the greatest environmental benefit, regulatory compliance, and strategic value to the organization. Question 13. Benchmark analysis indicates that a local community group has expressed significant concern regarding potential health impacts from a nearby industrial facility, citing a perceived increase in respiratory ailments. As a certified environmental, health and safety auditor operating under U.S. EPA regulations, which approach best addresses these concerns while adhering to established principles of environmental toxicology and risk assessment. Option A. Advise the community group that without definitive scientific proof of a causal link between the facility and their reported ailments, their concerns cannot be formally addressed by the auditing process. Option B. Immediately recommend the installation of advanced air filtration systems at the facility and in nearby homes, based on the community's reported symptoms, to mitigate potential airborne contaminants. Option C. Initiate a comprehensive risk assessment process, beginning with a thorough review of available toxicological data for chemicals potentially emitted by the facility, followed by an exposure assessment to determine potential routes and levels of contact, and finally characterizing the risk to the community based on scientifically validated dose-response relationships. Option D. Focus solely on the number of reported health complaints from the community to gauge the severity of the issue, and use this as the primary basis for recommending immediate regulatory action against the facility. The correct answer is C. Initiate a comprehensive risk assessment process, beginning with a thorough review of available toxicological data for chemicals potentially emitted by the facility, followed by an exposure assessment to determine potential routes and levels of contact, and finally characterizing the risk to the community based on scientifically validated dose-response relationships. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an EHS auditor to balance the immediate concerns of a community group with the scientific rigor and regulatory requirements of environmental toxicology and risk assessment. The auditor must navigate potential public perception issues, differing interpretations of scientific data, and the need for a defensible, evidence-based approach to risk communication. The pressure to provide a definitive answer quickly, without compromising the integrity of the assessment, is a key challenge. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it adheres to the established principles of environmental risk assessment as mandated by regulatory frameworks such as the U.S. EPA's guidelines. This involves a systematic process of hazard identification, dose-response assessment, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. By focusing on scientifically validated methodologies, peer-reviewed literature, and relevant regulatory standards, e.g., Clean Air Act (CERCLA), the auditor ensures that the risk assessment is robust, transparent, and legally defensible. This approach prioritizes accurate data interpretation and avoids premature conclusions, which is crucial for maintaining credibility and informing appropriate risk management decisions. It also aligns with ethical obligations to provide objective and scientifically sound information. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or the number of reported symptoms from community members, without correlating these to specific toxicant exposures and dose-response relationships, is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the scientific and regulatory requirements for hazard identification and dose-response assessment. Ethically, it risks misdirecting resources and causing undue alarm or complacency based on unsubstantiated claims. An approach that immediately proposes specific remediation actions or policy changes based on preliminary or incomplete data, without a thorough risk assessment, is also professionally unsound. This bypasses critical steps in the risk assessment process, such as characterizing the actual level of risk and evaluating the feasibility and effectiveness of proposed actions. Regulatory failure lies in not following established risk management protocols. Ethically, it can lead to ineffective or costly interventions and may not address the true source of any potential risk. An approach that dismisses community concerns outright due to a lack of immediate, quantifiable scientific evidence is professionally problematic. While scientific rigor is paramount, ignoring or devaluing community input can erode trust and hinder effective communication. Ethically, it fails to acknowledge the legitimate concerns of stakeholders and can create an adversarial relationship. While not a direct regulatory violation in itself, it undermines the collaborative aspect often required in environmental management. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured, science-based approach to risk assessment. This involves clearly defining the scope of the assessment, gathering relevant data, including environmental monitoring, toxicological literature, and exposure pathways, applying appropriate methodologies for hazard identification and dose-response evaluation, conducting a thorough exposure assessment, and finally, characterizing the risk. Communication with stakeholders should be ongoing, transparent, and based on the findings of the risk assessment, acknowledging uncertainties and outlining next steps. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with regulatory requirements and ethical responsibilities. Question 14. The risk matrix shows a potential soil contamination event involving an uncharacterized organic compound. As a certified environmental, health and safety auditor operating under U.S. EPA guidelines, which approach best aligns with regulatory compliance and sound environmental chemistry principles for assessing the chemical fate and transport of this contaminant. Option A. Rely on historical data from similar industrial sites in the region, assuming the uncharacterized compound will exhibit similar environmental behavior and transport characteristics. Option B. Assume the organic compound behaves like a typical hydrocarbon and will primarily adsorb to soil particles, with minimal leaching or volatilization, based on general knowledge of organic chemistry. Option C. Focus on the volume of the spilled material and its immediate visual impact on the soil surface, as this is the most direct indicator of the contamination severity. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive site-specific investigation utilizing appropriate analytical chemistry techniques to determine the contaminant's specific chemical properties, its interaction with soil components, adsorption, degradation, and its potential for leaching or volatilization, in accordance with RCRA and CERCLA assessment requirements. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive site-specific investigation utilizing appropriate analytical chemistry techniques to determine the contaminant's specific chemical properties, its interaction with soil components, adsorption, degradation, and its potential for leaching or volatilization, in accordance with RCRA and CERCLA assessment requirements. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an EHS auditor to bridge the gap between theoretical environmental chemistry principles and practical regulatory compliance, specifically concerning the chemical fate and transport of a contaminant in a complex soil matrix. The auditor must not only understand the chemical properties of the substance, but also how those properties interact with the soil environment and how these interactions are regulated under the specified jurisdiction. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the risk posed by the contaminant's movement and persistence, which directly impacts the scope and necessity of remediation efforts, and ensuring these assessments align with legal obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly applies established analytical chemistry techniques to characterize the contaminant and its behavior within the soil, aligning with regulatory requirements for site assessment and risk evaluation. This method prioritizes data-driven conclusions that are defensible under environmental law. By focusing on the chemical principles governing the contaminant's interaction with soil components, e.g., adsorption, degradation, leaching, the auditor can accurately predict its fate and transport, thereby informing appropriate regulatory actions and remediation strategies. This aligns with the ethical duty of an auditor to provide objective, evidence-based assessments that protect human health and the environment. An incorrect approach that relies solely on generic assumptions about organic compound behavior in soil fails to account for the specific chemical properties of the contaminant and the unique characteristics of the soil at the site. This is a regulatory failure because it bypasses the detailed site-specific investigations mandated by environmental regulations for assessing contamination. Ethically, it is a failure to exercise due diligence and professional skepticism. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on the initial spill volume without considering the subsequent chemical reactions and transport mechanisms is also a regulatory and ethical failure. Environmental regulations require a comprehensive understanding of contaminant behavior post-release, not just the quantity of the initial release. Ignoring chemical fate and transport leads to an incomplete risk assessment, potentially underestimating long-term environmental impact and failing to meet remediation objectives. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate visual evidence of contamination over chemical analysis is professionally unacceptable. While visual cues can be indicators, they are not sufficient for regulatory compliance or accurate risk assessment. Environmental laws require scientifically sound methods, including chemical analysis, to confirm the presence, concentration, and nature of contaminants. Relying solely on visual inspection is a significant regulatory failure and an ethical lapse in professional responsibility. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify the contaminant and its known chemical properties. 2. Understand the regulatory framework governing the specific type of contamination and the site. 3. Determine the relevant environmental media, soil, water, air, and their characteristics. 4. Select appropriate analytical chemistry techniques to characterize the contaminant and its behavior in the environmental media. 5. Apply principles of environmental chemistry, organic, inorganic water, air, soil chemistry, to predict chemical fate and transport. 6. Integrate these scientific findings with regulatory requirements to conduct a comprehensive risk assessment. 7. Document all findings and methodologies rigorously to ensure defensibility and compliance. Question 15. Investigation of a proposed expansion of a chemical manufacturing facility, which currently operates under RCRA and CAA permits, to determine the appropriate level of environmental impact assessment required by federal law, considering potential impacts on air quality, water discharge, hazardous waste generation, and the potential for disturbing a nearby wetland habitat that may be home to a federally listed endangered species. The facility is seeking state-level permits for the expansion, but there is a possibility of federal funding or oversight for certain aspects of the project. Option A. Focus solely on ensuring compliance with existing RCRA and CAA permits for the expansion, as these are the primary operational regulations governing the facility. Option B. Primarily assess the potential impacts on water discharge under the Clean Water Act, CWA, and the management of any new hazardous waste streams under RCRA, as these are the most direct environmental concerns for a chemical manufacturing expansion. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive NEPA review, including a potential environmental impact statement (EIS), by first identifying all federal permits, approvals, or funding that may be associated with the expansion, and then evaluating the potential for significant environmental impacts across all relevant federal statutes, CA, CWA, RCRA, ESSA, EPCRA, and cumulative effects. Option D. Assume NEPA is not applicable because the primary permits being sought are at the state level, and there is no immediate indication of direct federal permitting. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive NEPA review, including a potential environmental impact statement (EIS), by first identifying all federal permits, approvals, or funding that may be associated with the expansion, and then evaluating the potential for significant environmental impacts across all relevant federal statutes, CA, CWA, RCRA, ESSA, EPCRA, and cumulative effects. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for EHS auditors, assessing the potential environmental impact of a proposed facility expansion. The complexity arises from the need to integrate multiple federal environmental laws, understand their interdependencies, and determine the appropriate level of assessment required by NEPA. The auditor must navigate the nuances of what constitutes a major federal action and the threshold for requiring a full environmental impact statement, EIS, versus a less intensive environmental assessment, E. Failure to correctly identify the scope and requirements can lead to significant compliance issues, project delays, and potential litigation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic review of the proposed expansion's potential to affect protected resources and trigger federal review under NEPA. This necessitates identifying any federal permits or approvals that might be required, as these actions often serve as the nexus for NEPA applicability. The auditor must then evaluate whether the proposed activities could have a significant impact on the environment, considering factors outlined in NEPA regulations, e.g., 40 CFR Part 1508. 1. This methodical process ensures that the appropriate level of environmental review is conducted, fulfilling the spirit and letter of NEPA and preventing potential environmental harm. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the facility's existing RCRA compliance. While RCRA compliance is crucial for ongoing operations, it does not inherently address the new environmental impacts of an expansion or the procedural requirements of NEPA for federal actions. This approach fails to consider the broader environmental review mandated by NEPA for significant changes. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because no new federal permits are immediately obvious, NEPA is not triggered. This overlooks the possibility that indirect federal involvement, or the cumulative impacts of the expansion, when considered with other projects, might necessitate federal review. It also fails to consider that state or local permits might be tied to federal funding or oversight, thereby invoking NEPA. A third incorrect approach would be to only consider the Clean Water Act, CWA implications, such as stormwater runoff. While CWA compliance is vital, it is only one facet of potential environmental impacts. NEPA requires a holistic assessment of all potential environmental effects, including air quality CA, waste management RCRA, endangered species ESSA, and others, not just water-related concerns. Professional reasoning. When faced with a proposed facility expansion, an EHS auditor should first identify any potential federal nexus. This typically involves determining if federal permits, licenses, funding, or approvals are required for the project. If a federal nexus exists, the auditor must then assess whether the proposed action is likely to have a significant impact on the quality of the human environment, as defined by NEPA and its implementing regulations. This assessment should consider all potential environmental impacts across relevant federal statutes, CA, CWA, RCRA, ESSA, etc., and any cumulative effects. Based on this assessment, the auditor can then recommend the appropriate level of NEPA review, which could range from a categorical exclusion to an environmental assessment E, or a full environmental impact statement, EIS. Question 16. What factors determine the most appropriate and effective strategy for controlling airborne chemical exposures in a manufacturing facility, considering both regulatory compliance and worker well-being? Option A. The feasibility and effectiveness of implementing engineering controls, followed by administrative controls, and lastly, the appropriate selection and use of personal protective equipment, PPE, all informed by a thorough risk assessment and worker input. Option B. A reactive approach that addresses exposures only when they are reported as health issues or trigger regulatory action. Option C. The sole reliance on personal protective equipment, PPE, as the primary means of protection, assuming workers will consistently use it correctly. Option D. The lowest upfront cost of implementing any control measure, regardless of its long-term effectiveness or reliance on worker compliance. The correct answer is A. The feasibility and effectiveness of implementing engineering controls, followed by administrative controls, and lastly, the appropriate selection and use of personal protective equipment, PPE, all informed by a thorough risk assessment and worker input. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an EHS auditor to balance the immediate needs of workers with the long-term sustainability of control measures, all while adhering to specific regulatory requirements. The auditor must consider the practical implications of implementing controls, the effectiveness of different strategies, and the potential for unintended consequences. Careful judgment is required to ensure that chosen solutions are not only compliant but also effective, feasible, and protective of worker health. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, risk-based methodology that aligns with the principles of industrial hygiene and occupational health as outlined in relevant U.S. regulations, such as OSHA standards. This approach involves a thorough assessment of exposure, identification of the most effective control hierarchy, and consideration of worker input. It demonstrates a commitment to proactive hazard management and continuous improvement, which are core ethical and professional responsibilities for an EHS auditor. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the cheapest immediate solution fails to consider the long-term effectiveness and potential for recurring issues, potentially violating the employer's general duty to provide a safe workplace. Relying exclusively on personal protective equipment, PPE, without exploring engineering or administrative controls is a common regulatory failure, as OSHA hierarchy of controls mandates that PPE be the last resort. Ignoring worker feedback or the specific nature of the work environment can lead to the selection of inappropriate or ineffective controls, undermining the auditor's credibility and the safety program's integrity. Purely reactive approach, addressing issues only after they become significant problems, demonstrates a lack of foresight and proactive risk management, which is contrary to best practices and regulatory expectations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive hazard identification and risk assessment. This should be followed by an evaluation of control options based on the hierarchy of controls: elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. Worker involvement and feedback are crucial throughout this process. Finally, the selected controls must be monitored for effectiveness and adjusted as necessary, ensuring ongoing compliance and worker protection. Question 17. When evaluating environmental remediation technologies for a contaminated soil site, which approach best ensures compliance with regulatory cleanup standards and long-term site closure objectives? Option A. Implement a remediation strategy that focuses on containment rather than active removal or treatment, as this often presents fewer immediate technical challenges. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive comparative analysis of technically feasible technologies, evaluating their effectiveness against specific contaminants, regulatory cleanup goals, and long-term operational costs. Option C. Select a remediation technology based on its widespread use and familiarity among remediation contractors, irrespective of specific site contaminants. Option D. Prioritize technologies with the lowest initial capital expenditure, assuming they can achieve the required cleanup levels. The correct answer is D. Prioritize technologies with the lowest initial capital expenditure, assuming they can achieve the required cleanup levels. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for EHS auditors, selecting the most appropriate remediation technology for a contaminated site when multiple options exist, each with varying effectiveness, costs, and regulatory implications. The challenge lies in balancing technical feasibility, environmental protection, regulatory compliance, and economic considerations. A critical aspect is understanding the specific characteristics of the contamination, type, extent, media, and the site's context, geology, hydrology, intended future use, to make an informed decision that meets regulatory standards and stakeholder expectations. The auditor must navigate potential conflicts between short-term cost savings and long-term environmental liability. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive, data-driven decision-making process that prioritizes regulatory compliance and long-term site closure. This begins with a thorough site characterization to understand the nature and extent of contamination. Based on this, a comparative analysis of remediation technologies is conducted, considering factors such as effectiveness in addressing the specific contaminants, technical feasibility given site conditions, regulatory requirements for cleanup levels, potential for off-site impacts, and long-term operational and maintenance costs. The chosen technology must demonstrably achieve the required cleanup standards as defined by relevant environmental regulations, e.g., CERCLA, RCRA in the U.S. context, or equivalent national/regional legislation. This approach ensures that the remediation is not only technically sound, but also legally defensible and environmentally protective, minimizing future risks and liabilities. It aligns with the auditor's ethical duty to uphold environmental standards and regulatory mandates. Incorrect approaches analysis. Choosing a remediation technology solely based on the lowest upfront cost without a thorough evaluation of its long-term effectiveness and regulatory compliance is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach risks failing to achieve the required cleanup standards, leading to continued environmental degradation, potential future liability, and non-compliance with environmental laws. It prioritizes short-term economic gain over environmental protection and public health. Selecting a technology that is technically feasible but does not adequately address the specific contaminants or meet the established cleanup objectives is another regulatory failure. This could result in incomplete remediation, requiring further costly interventions later, and potentially violating the no further action or closure requirements stipulated by regulatory agencies. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to protect the environment. Opting for a remediation technology that is widely used or familiar without verifying its suitability for the specific site conditions and contaminants is a professional oversight. While familiarity can breed efficiency, it does not guarantee effectiveness. This can lead to wasted resources, prolonged remediation timelines, and failure to meet regulatory endpoints, constituting a failure to exercise professional judgment and due care. Professional reasoning. The professional decision-making process for selecting remediation technologies should follow a structured framework. 1. Site characterization. Thoroughly understand the nature, extent, and pathways of contamination. 2. Regulatory review. Identify all applicable federal, state, and local environmental regulations and cleanup standards. 3. Technology screening. Identify a range of potentially applicable remediation technologies based on site characterization and regulatory requirements. 4. Comparative analysis. Evaluate screen technologies against criteria including effectiveness, technical feasibility, cost, both capital and O&M, time to achieve cleanup, potential for off-site impacts, and regulatory acceptance. 5. Technology selection. Choose the technology or combination of technologies that best meets all criteria, with a strong emphasis on achieving regulatory compliance and long-term protectiveness. 6. Remediation system, design, and operation. Develop detailed plans for system implementation and ongoing operation. 7. Long-term monitoring. Establish a robust monitoring program to verify the effectiveness of the remediation and ensure continued compliance. Question 18. The evaluation methodology shows a proposed industrial development project where potential impacts on local air quality, water resources, and biodiversity are anticipated. Which of the following approaches to impact assessment is most professionally sound for this scenario? Option A. Utilizing a checklist approach that broadly categorizes potential impacts based on general industry experience, without detailed site-specific data collection or quantitative prediction. Option B. Employing a multi-criteria analysis framework that integrates expert judgment with quantitative modeling to assess the significance of predicted impacts across all identified environmental components, ensuring alignment with national environmental impact assessment guidelines. Option C. Focusing exclusively on air quality impacts using dispersion modeling, as this is often the most visible environmental concern for industrial projects, while deferring detailed assessment of water and biodiversity to later operational phases. Option D. Selecting a qualitative impact matrix that relies primarily on descriptive assessments and stakeholder opinions, with minimal emphasis on scientific data or predictive modeling for any environmental component. The correct answer is B. Employing a multi-criteria analysis framework that integrates expert judgment with quantitative modeling to assess the significance of predicted impacts across all identified environmental components, ensuring alignment with national environmental impact assessment guidelines. Explanation. The scenario presents a challenge for an EHS auditor because it requires discerning the most appropriate impact assessment methodology when faced with multiple options, each with potential strengths and weaknesses. The auditor must not only understand the technical aspects of each method, but also consider their suitability for the specific project context, regulatory requirements, and the nature of potential environmental impacts. Professional judgment is crucial in selecting a method that is robust, defensible, and effectively informs decision-making for mitigation and management. The correct approach, which involves selecting a methodology that is comprehensive, scientifically sound, and aligned with relevant regulatory frameworks, e.g., NEPA in the U.S. or equivalent national legislation, represents best professional practice. This ensures that the assessment adequately identifies, predicts, and evaluates the potential environmental consequences of a proposed action. It also facilitates the development of appropriate mitigation measures and contributes to informed regulatory compliance and sustainable development. Adherence to established guidelines and standards within the chosen jurisdiction is paramount. An incorrect approach might involve selecting a methodology that is overly simplistic or lacks the scientific rigor to adequately identify significant impacts. This could lead to underestimation of risks, inadequate mitigation planning, and potential non-compliance with environmental regulations. Ethically, it fails to uphold the auditor's responsibility to provide a thorough and accurate assessment. Another incorrect approach could be choosing a method that is not appropriate for the specific type of project or the scale of potential impacts, leading to irrelevant or misleading findings. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of impact assessment principles and professional due diligence. Furthermore, selecting a methodology solely based on cost or ease of implementation, without regard for its effectiveness in identifying and evaluating environmental impacts, constitutes a significant professional and ethical failure. Professionals should approach such situations by first thoroughly understanding the project's scope, objectives, and the regulatory context. They should then research and evaluate available impact assessment methodologies, considering their strengths, limitations, data requirements, and suitability for the specific environmental setting and potential impacts. Consultation with subject matter experts and stakeholders, where appropriate, can also inform the selection process. The final decision should be based on a reasoned justification that prioritizes the accuracy, comprehensiveness, and defensibility of the assessment, ensuring it meets regulatory requirements and supports effective environmental management. Question 19. The monitoring system demonstrates that a specific waste segregation procedure, as documented in the EMS manual, is not being consistently followed by operational staff during routine activities. The environmental aspect associated with this waste stream is identified as significant. What is the most appropriate next step for the certified environmental, health, and safety auditor? Option A. Document the nonconformity and suggest a minor amendment to the procedure without further investigation into the root cause. Option B. Immediately recommend a complete revision of the documented waste segregation procedure to align with observed practices. Option C. Conduct interviews with the operational staff involved to understand the reasons for the deviation and assess the adequacy of their training and the clarity of the procedure. Option D. Classify the deviation as a minor issue with no significant environmental impact and close the observation without corrective action. The correct answer is C. Conduct interviews with the operational staff involved to understand the reasons for the deviation and assess the adequacy of their training and the clarity of the procedure. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental management systems, EMS, where a discrepancy arises between documented procedures and actual site practices. The professional challenge lies in accurately assessing the effectiveness of the EMS, identifying the root cause of the nonconformity, and recommending appropriate corrective actions that ensure both compliance and continual improvement. The auditor must navigate the complexities of human behavior, operational realities, and the stringent requirements of ISO 14001. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation to understand why the deviation occurred. This includes interviewing personnel involved, reviewing operational logs, and assessing the adequacy of training and communication related to the specific environmental aspect. Identifying the root cause is paramount for effective corrective action. If the root cause is inadequate training, then retraining is the appropriate solution. If it's a procedural flaw, the procedure needs revision. This approach aligns with ISO 14001 clauses related to operational control, competence, training and awareness, and corrective actions, ensuring the EMS remains effective and drives continual improvement. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately assume the documented procedure is flawed and recommend a complete overhaul without understanding the operational reality. This bypasses the critical step of root cause analysis and could lead to unnecessary and costly changes, failing to address the actual problem. Ethically, this is inefficient and potentially misleading. Another incorrect approach would be to simply document the nonconformity and recommend a minor procedural tweak without investigating the underlying reasons for the deviation. This fails to address the root cause, making it likely that the nonconformity will recur, thus undermining the principle of continual improvement central to ISO 14001. This also represents a failure in the auditor's duty to ensure the EMS is effective. A third incorrect approach would be to dismiss the deviation as a minor oversight with no significant environmental impact and take no corrective action. This directly violates the requirements of ISO 14001 regarding monitoring, measurement, and corrective actions, and it fails to uphold the auditor's responsibility to ensure the integrity of the EMS. It also creates an ethical risk by allowing potential noncompliance to persist. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first gathering objective evidence through observation and interviews. They should then apply a structured problem-solving methodology, such as the Plan-Do-Check Act, PDCA cycle, to identify the root cause of any nonconformity. The focus should always be on understanding the why behind the observed situation before proposing solutions. This ensures that corrective actions are targeted, effective, and contribute to the overall robustness and continual improvement of the EMS, adhering to both the standards requirements and professional ethical obligations. Question 20. Benchmark analysis indicates that a manufacturing facility is planning a significant modification to its primary combustion process, involving the introduction of a new fuel source and an increase in operational temperature. The facility currently holds air permits under the Clean Air Act, CA, and hazardous waste permits under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. As a certified environmental, health and safety auditor, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with environmental regulations? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the facility's existing CAA permits to assess potential impacts on air emissions and determine if a permit modification is required, while also initiating a comprehensive RCRA review to evaluate any changes in hazardous waste generation, characterization, and management practices. Option B. Recommend that the facility submit a notification to the relevant environmental agency regarding the change in fuel source and temperature, without a detailed assessment of potential impacts on air emissions or waste streams, trusting the agency to identify any necessary permit adjustments. Option C. Advise the facility to proceed with the operational modification and address any potential environmental issues reactively as they arise, relying on the assumption that existing permits cover unforeseen circumstances. Option D. Focus exclusively on updating the facility's air quality monitoring plan to capture any new or altered air pollutants resulting from the modified combustion process, assuming waste management practices will remain unchanged. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of the facility's existing CAA permits to assess potential impacts on air emissions and determine if a permit modification is required, while also initiating a comprehensive RCRA review to evaluate any changes in hazardous waste generation, characterization, and management practices. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an auditor to navigate the complex interplay between different environmental regulations, specifically the Clean Air Act, CA, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, in the context of a facility undergoing a significant operational change. The auditor must not only identify potential noncompliance, but also determine the appropriate regulatory pathways for addressing emissions and waste management, considering both existing permits and the need for new ones. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the scope of the change, its potential environmental impacts, and the corresponding legal obligations under distinct regulatory frameworks. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a thorough understanding of the regulatory requirements for both air emissions and hazardous waste. By recognizing that the modification to the combustion process will likely alter air emission characteristics and potentially generate new or different waste streams, the auditor correctly prioritizes a comprehensive review of both CAA and RCRA compliance. This involves assessing the need for permit modifications under both acts, ensuring that any new or modified permits accurately reflect the facility's operations and environmental controls. This proactive and holistic approach aligns with the auditor's ethical responsibility to ensure full compliance and prevent potential environmental harm. It also reflects best practice in environmental auditing by considering the interconnectedness of different environmental media and regulatory programs. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach fails by focusing solely on air emissions under the CAA. This is a regulatory failure because it ignores the potential for the altered combustion process to generate hazardous waste, which falls under RCRA. Failing to assess RCRA compliance could lead to improper waste characterization, storage, or disposal, resulting in significant legal penalties and environmental damage. Ethically, it represents a failure to conduct a comprehensive audit. Another incorrect approach is to assume that existing permits are sufficient without a detailed review. This is a regulatory failure because significant operational changes often trigger permit review and modification requirements under both the CAA and RCRA. Relying on outdated permits can lead to violations of emission limits or waste management standards. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to uphold professional standards. A third incorrect approach is to only consider the immediate operational change without evaluating potential long-term impacts or future regulatory changes. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because environmental auditing requires foresight and a consideration of the broader compliance landscape. Ignoring potential future liabilities or the need for more stringent controls based on evolving regulations is unprofessional and can expose the facility to future noncompliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such scenarios by first understanding the scope of the operational change and its potential environmental implications across all relevant media. This involves a systematic review of applicable regulations, including the CAA, RCRA, and any other relevant acts, e.g., CWA, EPCRA. The auditor should then identify specific regulatory requirements triggered by the change, such as permit modifications, new permit applications, or reporting obligations. A critical step is to document all findings and recommendations clearly, prioritizing actions that ensure immediate compliance and mitigate future risks. This structured approach ensures that all regulatory obligations are addressed comprehensively and ethically.